Okay, I'm Mike Tucker. I was one of the special effects technicians on Red Dwarf from Series 2 onwards. And this is a little bit of behind the scenes footage shot during the making of Series 5. Right, well, this is the special effects department as it was, now demolished, sadly. We moved in there sort of in the 70s. About 70 people working there at the point that I joined. So obviously a fairly large space. Vac formers, metal bending machines, welding booths, workshops, you name it, it was there on site, as well as a fairly well-equipped model stage, which is where the bulk of the Red Dwarf effects were actually shot. The crew of Red Dwarf pretty much stayed the same from about season 3 onwards. There was a sort of regular team of us who were both interested in model work and interested in science fiction model work. So Rocky, Paul, Nick Cool, all of us with different areas of expertise, if you like. Andy Bowman, obviously our electronics and mechanisms guy. James, heavy engineering and rigging, though having said that, although we were all specialising, everyone did multi-skill on it, I think is the current term. Pete Tyler, who shot almost everything for us. Me, with more hair. And this is Peter Ragg, who was the visual effects designer on all series of Red Dwarf that we handled. Creatures, a fair number of creatures sort of over the years on the show. Myself, of course, having played one of the creatures in an earlier season, having been the Blob in Camille. In this case, we had a large, gangly demon, which I know was seriously looked at as being a man in a suit, which would have been Paul McGuinness. He was always our large, gangly demons. But in this case, it was decided at the end of the day to go with a puppet. And Rocky had certainly expressed interest in sculpting this particular thing. I think he wanted a chance to stretch his sculpting muscles.
Tell us what you're up to.
He launched into it. We all did various designs for this thing. And in the end, Rob and Doug plumped for a very strange, eyeless design that I'd come up with, which Rocky then decided, right, he's going to turn this into 3D. Planned to make something about 8 foot tall in the end. And started off just getting the head sorted out, because the head was primarily the thing we were going to concentrate on.
In order to make them televisionally viable.
Strangely, I don't actually think the full demon ever made it to screen. I think in the end it was seen as silhouettes and cutaways of hands and feet. But having said that, we didn't know this at this stage. Always the nice thing about Red Dwarf is that you launched into it never quite knowing what you were going to do and how it was going to work once the cameras started rolling. Fairly sort of straightforward technique, this, rather than going with a complicated armature and foam latex or silicon skins, which would definitely be the way it would be handled these days. It was going to be a fairly robust metal skeleton that was going to be hand puppeteered, and over that there was going to be a latex and foam skin. So plaster molds taken off everything. Again, if you go film industry or something that was going to be used multiple times, you'd probably gone for the durability of a fiberglass mold. But 90% of the stuff we did on Dwarf was going to be used once. So it was like, don't waste your time and effort making a beautiful mold. Make one mold, get it out of the way quickly, and get a creature out of it. So basically, Rocky molded the thing, and then everyone chips in when the molds start to get a bit too big for one person to handle. So James and Nick at this point have got involved, because the legs of the creature have now been cast, the torso of the creature's been cast, the arms have been cast separately. So everything starts to get fairly weighty and does require several people to lug it around. Here we've got the first bits and pieces actually getting out of the mould. Process is, once you've got your plaster mould, you paint latex in the various base colour that you want into it, and then pour this 2-part expanding foam into the void, and you end up with a flexible, rubbery monster, albeit with a metal skeleton inside it. Then you've got to work out which bits of it need touching up, which seams need trimming off, hooves need putting on, all the rest of it. And then you can start looking into the mechanics of it. Peter had decided that he wanted a little bit more mechanism in the head. So it was pretty much decided early on there were going to be two of these. There was going to be the full-length puppet, which would be used for long shots. And then there would be a close-up sort of down to the waist that could be a little bit more articulated for close shots. Again, you know, it's surprising in retrospect, given how little the thing actually made it onto screen, how much effort went into constructing the thing. So at this stage, again, we'd come to the conclusion that although it had dialogue to speak, Peter didn't want this huge, great jaw flapping around. So it was like almost the back of the esophagus was the bit that was going to do the speaking, hence that had the hand puppet in there, which you can just see wiggling around in the back of the throat. Whereas the main jaw opening was done by pneumatics. So again, you're working across the various skills in the team here, in that you've got Rocky doing the sculpting. I think Paul sculpted the back of the throat. Then James and Nick moved on to the mechanics of the thing. Again, sort of in the workshop here, you can see various trappings of old Red Dwarf spacecraft and things in the back of shot. I think it was Justice World perched on top of a cupboard back there. And wherever possible, keep it simple. Instead of making a mechanism that would raise the thing out of the pit in the floor, we decided it would be James lying under the set and he'd just lift the thing up on cue. I think we'd established from Mel that his set wasn't going to be a huge distance off the floor. It was only going to be 3 or 4 feet. So having James lying on his back and lifting the thing through shot was probably the simplest and cheapest way of doing it. Once all these mechanics and bits and pieces are fitted on the inside, it's getting the outside to look as decent to the camera as possible. Nobody really cares whether it's messy or not that photogenic underneath the rubber skin, but once it gets to the outside, obviously, the thing needs to look good from most camera positions. Again, from the point of view that we don't really know how it's going to be filmed until we dragged it into studio on the day. This is the full-length puppet, and Rocky launching into the paint job on it. Again, sort of, the thing's got a sort of a base green colour on it. And from there, he's going to build it up to a slightly lighter flesh tone. Again, what Rocky's going through here is, having started with a fairly dark base colour, he works up with progressively lighter and lighter washes of colour and highlights, sponging a lot of it on rather than airbrushing it. Again, sort of keeping it fairly bold so that all the muscle structure's coming out, again on the basis that the thing's going to be seen in relatively low light conditions, and knowing that the set was going to be lit by firelight. You don't want to be too subtle about it. You could end up spending an awful lot of time airbrushing veins and all sorts of detail into these sort of things, and then realising that it's simply just not going to be seen on camera. It's quite a theatrical technique, but it does get across quite bold statements on camera very, very quickly. And of course, having done the full-length puppet, he had to move across to the half-scale puppet and make sure that two things are painted the same.
And that's all recorded. I'm just faking. Rocky Alan Marshall, in close-up, admits I'm just faking. I'm faking this organism.
As always with Red Dwarf, we tended to work quite late into the evenings, and it tended to be the Dwarf team were there on their own, both evenings and weekends. So it got quite good for us. So sort of we sort of worked as a very good team, as well as the sort of the creatures. We've also got a fair number of hand props within Red Dwarf. Hand prop possibly being very appropriate for this particular one. This was Kryten's hand that got pulled off in the Terraform show, and then it has to run around on its own, goes into Red Dwarf, looks around, goes to find Lister. So there were various versions of this made. There was the version that was actually pulled off Robert's fake arm as Kryten. There was the mechanical version, which could be puppeteered and could do all these gross movements, eyeball blinks, hand fiddles, all the rest of it. And then there was a fully mechanical version, sort of, that was just like set going and set scurrying through the studio. That one was literally sort of have somebody in the go position to turn it on, and then somebody in a position to catch it as it scurried out of the set. He was brilliant, because I think by the time it had its little sort of meep noises over the top of it and blink noises, cartoon blink noises, this became a very popular sort of little prop within the show. Paul tended to handle a lot of the sort of electronic devices that were done on Red Dwarf, the PSI scans and stuff like that. This was from the holoship communicator, so he's worked out a basic shape of the thing. He's done a pattern in wood, vac formed over that to give you a hollow plastic shell, and then that's going to handle all the sort of, or house all the batteries and the LEDs. Again, quite a lot of work went into the flashing light props. By comparison, the robot arm, skeletal arm of Kryten, was based around an angle poised lamp. So where possible, we were doing stuff very, very fast. The syringe, again, used in a couple of series. Andy made a really clever mechanism here whereby all the liquid actually in the sort of the glass barrel went back into the handle. So that ended up being used sort of a couple of series running. Model work within Red Dwarf, I think, was the thing that really sort of came into its own in Series 3 when Starbug and the Starbug hangar and all the rest of it started off, and then increased with the number of spacecraft we were doing from there on. This inevitably started with us heading out to Hamleys or Beatties or somewhere like that and buying hundreds of pounds worth of Japanese robot kits and tank kits, and then explaining to the slightly bemused sales assistant that we weren't going to build the models at all. We were just going to take all the bits and stick them onto models that we'd made ourselves. We did start each series knowing that we'd have a variety of dressing that we were going to need, and then sort of divide that up as the scripts came in and the number of spacecraft became established. In this case, the Esperanto was our major spacecraft in Series 5, which was this underwater wreck, which, again, was going to be quite well detailed in scale with one of the smaller Starbugs. And knowing pretty much our camera positions, it was only detailed up on one side. The off-camera side of this thing had no detail at all, just a waste of time and effort on everybody's part to do stuff that's not going to be seen on camera. So it was established fairly early on by sticking camera on it and finding out good camera angles where that was going to be. By comparison, Paul's holoship was going to be seen in a variety of different configurations and from all sides. So he went to an awful lot of effort to make sure that that looked good from all angles. Getting the thing sprayed up yellow here. One of the nice things that we did on Red Dwarf, and again, I think this is a little bit of Rocky's influence, is that he always maintained that Thunderbirds was a fantastic show because each of the craft was instantly recognisable. You knew what it was by what colour it was. Thunderbird 4 is yellow, Thunderbird 3 is orange. And we did sort of carry that through to the spacecraft on Red Dwarf, in that the Blue Midget is blue, surprisingly. Starbug is green. Therefore, OK, we've got a guest ship, let's go for yellow, let's go for orange, let's go for something really striking to differentiate it from the other sort of major ships.
As if by magic.
Certain sequences we did actually almost test out, like, this is what we'd like to happen. So we'd sit around, work out a sequence, get Peter or one of us to walk the models through where we wanted them to actually land, where we wanted them to fly, and just see if they were going to work on camera. So this was trying to work out, we wanted little figures walking from the Starbug towards the Esperanto. So was this a good camera position?
You've got this in shot, you've got little lights coming towards it.
As it happened, we rejigged that by the time we actually got around to shooting it and had a slightly different setup on camera. Again, one of the things that used to happen every year was rebuild the Starbugs, get the shattered, broken and generally burnt shells that had been crashed, burnt, destroyed, blown up from the previous season, put them back together, and, where possible, build new ones. For Series 5, we knew that there were several things that Starbug needed to do. One of it was have tracks come out of it. So a new Starbug shell was built into which Andy could fit his mechanised tracks. Similarly, there was another one, which was the underwater Starbug, which had a propeller at the back end. So I think we had more Starbugs built this year than any other year. I think there were about 5 or 6 by the time we'd finished this series. All various scales, sort of large ones, medium-sized ones, very, very small ones. Most of the mechanics that are being put together here were for the large-scale one. This was for the underwater Starbug. This is one of the legs being pulled into its folded-up position. And there you can see a number of the Starbugs being put together. The Esperanto, by this stage, being quite encrusted with barnacles. The Hero Starbug, that was used from Series 3 onwards, is the fully painted one there. And there's Rocky launching into making one of the duplicates. I don't think a single season went by where we didn't end up destroying the Starbug in some form or other. Guest sort of bases and space stations were always one of those things that you knew that they were only going to be seen in 2 or 3 establishing shots, but at the same time they needed to look quite stylish and recognisable, but weren't going to take up an awful lot of screen time. So how could you get an awful lot of stuff on screen very, very quickly? And plumbing fittings tended to sort of come into things a fair bit. This was the snow base that was going to be used. And I think Nick and Rocky put that together in about 3 days. Once all these models are done, we're onto the model stage. This is down at 250 Western Avenue. Large space, about, 60 by 40. Black drapes and CSO blue drapes around it. And Pete Tyler's motion control camera that was a portable rig that used to come in every year, set it up. And we tended to rattle out motion control shots at the beginning of the run and then move on to the slightly more dynamic crashes towards the end on the basis that you want your beauty shots of the various craft to look, at their best right at the beginning of the series. And by the time we'd crashed the Starbug a couple of times, it was always looking a bit grotty, so leave those shots to the end. I mentioned there were various scales of Starbug. I think this was the smallest one we ever did. It was about 1 inch long, 1.5 inches long. But having said that, it still had little working lights in the engines and all the rest of it. The Red Dwarf, second version thereof, slightly smaller than the original model, which had come to a slightly unfortunate end, having fallen off a shelf after being put up there on a forklift truck. So we went to the trouble of building a new one to get the shots that we needed for Series 5. And then, of course, the scripts came in that it was going to be blown up. So having built a new Red Dwarf, we entered the series without one again. All the hangars had been kept in storage since Season 3. So again, one of the first things that you did at the beginning of every series of Red Dwarf, as well as getting out things like the Starbug and the Bazookoids, was drag out the hangars, fix anything that had been knocked off in the interim period, repaint accordingly, and go through all the scripts and find out what new things needed to happen this time. So 2 scales of hangar. This was the large one, the 25th scale hangar, which stood about 8 foot tall when completed. And that tended to comprise the Starbug landing bay and the first couple of feet of the launch corridor, whereas the 50th scale model tended to be the full launch corridor and the exterior of the Red Dwarf again. What we got here is the Dwarf being prepared for its big pyro sequence. As with all sort of pyros that are meant to take place in deep space, to try and give the air of zero gravity, the camera's placed on the floor looking vertically up, and the model is suspended in the ceiling. That meant obviously suspending blacks right across the roof and then dropping a scaffold bar down through those blacks, so we've got something to fit the model onto. All the pyrotechnics are then wired onto it, lines taken up through the black backing, across and back down to the floor again to the firing position. So all the setups on these are fairly time-consuming. But having said that, we were in the lucky position that we had pretty much constant use of the model stage. We weren't like ducking in and out or going back into studio. we were able to sort of schedule our own model filming sort of relatively well, so that once we got all our hero shots in the can, we could get onto the pyro stuff. All of this is shot at very, very high speed. We used a camera called a photosonics camera that goes up to 2,000 frames a second, and the whine that you hear just prior to the shoot is the camera coming to speed. And then the actual event, you know, is over very, very quickly. Unfortunately, it caught fire, by which point it's 15 foot in the air, and we don't have fire extinguishers that reach it. It did put itself out, fortunately. Otherwise, that would have been slightly embarrassing. Knowing that we only had one Red Dwarf, and it would be foolish to actually completely obliterate the thing on our first take, Peter elected to do a set of very visual but non-destructive charges for the first take, make sure that we had all that in the can, and then actually go through the process of blowing the thing up completely on take 2. This gave us the sort of like the fallback position of knowing that everything we got back from day 1 was okay before we actually blew the thing to pieces. Not always we were that lucky. Sometimes you had one crack at it and no chance to actually reshoot. But obviously, not to waste time, while we're waiting for rushes to go back, we shot a number of other pyrotechnics while we were in this particular configuration. So again, high-speed camera, very fast camera speed, and having got back successful rushes so that we knew that we had take 1 in the can, we could then go through the process of, rewire the Red Dwarf, this time with high explosives, and knowing that we can actually get the full destruction this time round. It's always quite nerve-wracking doing these things, because there's an awful lot of build-up towards it, and then the event itself is so fast. And this time there's absolutely nothing left of it and no chance of going for a second take. Having got that out the way, everything's stripped out the stage and we're back into a completely different setup. This was this is the snow base that was being constructed earlier. So we've got about a 15 by 20 foot tabletop setup here. Snow is something that we knew looked good from having done Series 3. We'd come up with some nice techniques of doing scale blizzards. And so we were sort of fairly confident that we could launch into this one and give the scene an awful lot of depth, even though we're actually quite close to the back cloth and there's not a lot of detail back there. We knew it's going to be buried under layers of snow. So the foreground snow was done by effect snow machines. The mid-range snow was done with talcum powder being fed through fans, and the real background snow was just done with smoke, and it creates, a real nice depth across the scene. Once you've got sort of broad strokes of the model laid out, you normally then sort of tweak to camera positions, and what's going on here is that we've got the camera set, we know what's going to look good, and Pete's just tweaking foreground detail to make the shot slightly more interesting. Again, I think we were setting these things up in about a day, spending about a day and a half shooting them, and then stripping them down and getting the next model set in. So the turnaround on these, fairly fast, again, knowing that they're only going to be on screen as establishers for the particular episode. Roughly from camera position here, just sort of showing the foreground rock that we had the Starbug come in and land on. And we were able to get point of view shots from the Starbug looking towards the Arctic base. We were able to put foreground icicles in, and also this provided the backdrop for all our Christmas cards that year. I think all of us took photos of the set. I think there was even a shot of the Starbug with a bit of holly on it, which was used as the Grant Naylor Christmas cards that year. This is Paul setting up the holoship. Again, you're leapfrogging. You've got one crew building while one crew's on the stage. As we were filming the snow base, so Paul was finishing off the work on the holoship. And this had literally thousands upon thousands of feet of fibre optics going into it. And because the thing was meant to be a hologram and meant to be partly transparent, we were able to get away with a lot of double exposure stuff here. So having shot a lot of the Red Dwarf shots earlier on in the shoot, they'd been held back knowing that they were going to be double exposed with the holoship over the top of it. So at this point, Paul's on the stage doing that. Myself, Rocky and Nick were off redressing the hangar. That was for the high and the low versions of the Red Dwarf. So knowing that we had the set in its standard form, in its very, very white form and its very, very grungy form, meant that we had to actually work sort of within the schedule, knowing when we could get that thing out, redress it, and have something else to film to get back. This is another sequence that never actually made it. This was meant to be the little hatch underneath the Starbug where the Scouter emerges from.
1, 2, 3.
Hi everybody, it's me again.
Rocky, as always, unable to resist the opportunity to clown around on camera.
And so another episode of Red
The camera itself there is mounted upside down because this hatch is obviously meant to be on the underbelly of the Starbug, and we would have flipped that at the transfer.
Quite exciting.
The final setup that I think we had on the model stage that year was the underwater setup from the Esperanto. Now, all the sort of basic rock shapes and background and everything is what was previously the snowscape. Rather than sort of stripping everything out and starting again from scratch, you just rejig the set, leave all the sort of the salt forming the basis of the shape of the undersea landscape, and then that was dressed over the top with a combination of fuller's earth and cement dust. And then to give it an underwater feel, we suspended a large but shallow Perspex tank over the top of the model and shine a light through it to give this sort of interactive lighting effect. And then had a sort of foot deep by, I don't know, about 8 foot long tank in front of it that we filmed through. So you're filming through water and you have water effects coming down onto the set itself. And then to create the bubbles, we actually dropped Alka-Seltzer into the tank prior to each shoot. The Starbug itself puppeteered in the time-honoured Jerry Anderson way of swinging it around on wires. Sounds very crude, but remarkably effective by the time you've actually shot this at high speed. It also allowed us to do multiple takes until we got something that was actually looking good on camera. Various people had various goes at flying the Starbug. It was always quite a knack, sort of getting a smooth movement and being able to hit your marks sort of each time. I mean, in this case, I'm having a crack at it. Peter was always very good at flying the model. And depending on, you know, the weight of the model and the size of the model, depending on sort of who was bunged on the other end of the cantilever, really. The larger models were flown by Peter. The downside of doing it this way is that inevitably you have to use very, very fine wires in order that they're not showing up on camera. If they do show up on camera, then obviously you're going through complex post-production procedures to actually get rid of those wires. So it was working out a wire thickness that was thin enough to hold the weight of the Starbug, but still not be seen. And as you can see from what's about to come up, we didn't always get that right. And when they broke, it was fairly catastrophic.
Oh, cut that on tape.
That's the end of filming for that day while the Starbug is repaired. Again, we were quite lucky in that sort of over the sort of 10 years that we worked on it, we didn't really have any catastrophic failures of wires on any of the miniatures. They were always sort of hauled off and repaired fairly quickly. That's quite a good angle showing the back end of the Esperanto, showing the fact that, you know, we simply didn't build any of that side of it because it wasn't needed.
Stand by.
What it did mean for all these shots is that somebody always had the unenviable task of being up a scaffold tower, just making sure that the overhead tank rippled nicely. So while everyone else is running around down on the studio floor, somebody had the job of sitting above quite a lot of lamps and just making nice ripply shapes across the model. We also, again, it's not something that really shows up that well on screen, but we actually went through the business of calling Starbug 2 in this case, to imply that there were several of these that could be used. If I'd had my way, I'd have done it bright yellow and had a 4 on the fin, but there we go.
needed, you see. It was an
And
instant
once again,
change.
just to get Rocky in the picture.
This is the number, and we needed it because, well, basically, I needed a wig again.
The giant squid never made it onto screen either, and perhaps now you can see why.
But for those of
It
you
was
that are sort of
implied rather than shown in all its glory. But it was thrown together very quickly, and as Rocky's about to demonstrate where it came from,
and it came from over here.
was the moulds from the head of the demon. So it was one of those things, we need a squid very quickly. Where do you get an alien squid from? Right, find something that we can mould, get a quick cast out of it, stick eyes and tentacles on it.